Lovely. Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. I assume that someone will tell me if you can't see my slides or if there's any issues.
Oh,
Hi,
fine.
everyone. Okay, lovely. I am so unbelievably excited to be here. Because as I was kind of saying when we first started, every time I present this work, I kind of leave with more questions than I can give answers, which I think is often a sign that this is an area of kind of interest and energy, and that there's kind of movement and discussion. Um, yeah, so my talk is called Reflexivity in Quantitative Research, Rethinking the Myth of Neutral Numbers, which sounds sort of slightly melodramatic. But what I'm kind of going to present today is it's less of a sort of research talk. So I'm not going to present any empirical data to you. It's more some of the things that I've been thinking about over the past few years. And a lot of this is really kind of open for us as sort of scholars, and particularly feminist scholars, to grapple with collectively. So I'm hoping that I'll kind of present some ideas, give you some stuff to think about, and then we'll have a really nice kind of discussion about some of this. As I say to kind of students, I think there's some of my students here, that I'm very, very open to be disagreed with. I think it's probably more fun if there is some kind of disagreement and challenge. So I think a lot of this is stuff that I'm kind of yeah, trying to suss out with some colleagues and think about how this might make sense for different kind of research approaches. So just to kind of start with that as a caveat. So I find it really difficult to do the kind of slide of this is who I am and this is what I do, because I have been something of a sort of academic magpie over the past few years, where I kind of am attracted to different shiny things. But generally I am, or I kind of used to be a quantitative experimental feminist social psychologist. My PhD was in experimental feminist social psychology. I then kind of somewhere along the way turned into a pedagogical researcher. So I do a lot of scholarship of teaching and learning type research. And now I've kind of decided fairly recently that I think I'm probably a meta scientist. So this means that a lot of my science and scholarship and research at the moment is about how to do science, scholarship, and research better, and how to kind of bring some of the values, particularly feminist values, to science reform and to kind of improving, particularly the psychological sciences. So I'm a psychologist. I think the thing that connects my work is that I care a lot about asking really big disciplines of my discipline and of kind of science and research more generally. So I care about asking questions like, what is it that we are doing here? Who does our research serve? Who could our research serve? How do we know that what we're doing is any good, and who gets to decide? And I also think, and kind of most importantly for the context of this talk, I think that as human beings who often research other human beings, that we are inherently biased, and that's what makes us human, and that's what makes us good researchers. So to kind of set my stall out from the beginning, this is the approach that I am coming from. So the kind of context here is, so a lot of my PhD was in feminist social psychology a few years ago, a couple of years ago now. And then I started to get really interested in this conversation that was happening in psychology at the time around open science. So I categorize open science as anything and all things that are trying broadly to improve research. So trying to improve the credibility of research, the openness of research, the transparency of research. And what's really interesting to me is that in psychology, this is kind of there's been a huge interest in open science and making things more open and transparent, that's come from what I refer to as the crisis of crises. So at one point, psychologists were saying that we're in a replication crisis because none of our work can be replicated. Then it turned into a credibility crisis because there was concerns about credibility. We've been in a reproducibility crisis. There's now talk about how we're in a generalizability crisis. There's been a lot of kind of energy and discussion about how we can do our research better, that's kind of leaked out into other disciplines. And what's interesting to me is that this has led to, particularly since kind of 2011 onwards, this has led to a huge number of new tools, resources, and practices that are trying to do things differently, that are kind of call themselves like open science tools. So there's been things like some different ways of publishing, so trying to get peer review before you collect any data, so that try and kind of hammer out publication bias. There's been a big emphasis on open data sharing to try and kind of up reproducibility and allow kind of checking. And generally, there's been a real kind of response to this crisis of crises has focused on trying to improve transparency of the research process and trying to kind of open up the aspects of the research process that used to be the stuff that was kind of hidden. And particularly in psychology, but particularly in kind of my small home of social psychology, there has been a lot of emphasis on kind of engaging in open science tools, and particularly with the view to try and combat questionable research practices. So people have talked about questionable research practices like p-hacking, so like hacking away at your data and trying to find something significant because we know that significant results are more likely to be published than null results. And questionable research practices that go all the way from kind of outright falsifying data all the way through to kind of making unclear or untransparent decisions in the research process. And so this is kind of where I sort of came to this work from. And what's been interesting to me, and increasingly interesting to me, and kind of now like all I spend my days thinking about, is about how some of these open science narratives and tools, how they position the issue of researcher bias. And the kind of approach that I think that a lot of these mainstream open science tools and practices and conversations come from is that researcher bias is inherently a problem. So there have been some people have kind of written about open science tools as a vaccine to researcher bias. So it's the thing that's going to kind of stamp out bias. And I think that this is really interesting because this kind of perpetuates this idea that if we are aware of our biases, then we can control them, we can remove them, and that's good, that's robust, that's rigor. It also kind of comes from this point of view that what you see in the data, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, whatever it is, should also be, if we care about reproducibility, should also be what I see in the data. So this kind of reproducibility is also a gold standard of rigor. And what this means fundamentally is that it also kind of assumes that all research, or for research to be open, to be transparent, and to be rigorous and robust, that it kind of comes from this quite positivist epistemological position. So it implicitly comes from this point of view. And what I've been trying to do over the past few years is articulate that this is a thing, that this is what's happening, and also to try and think about what the consequences of this may be for people who come from different approaches. So I think that this is a problem. I think it's a problem that we're not kind of attentive to what these kind of narratives might be doing. I think it's a problem for a number of different reasons. So I've kind of written about with some colleagues about how actually framing bias as something that is inherently problematic and something that we need to get rid of, that what that can do is it can push people who are already at the kind of epistemological margins, it pushes them further out. So it kind of perpetuates this idea that unbiased research is possible, that it's possible to be to be humans studying other humans and to approach that in a way that is free from bias. And it also perpetuates this idea that detachment and objectivity and kind of lack of bias is credibility. And I think that this is problematic for lots of different reasons. I think it means that it hasn't yet invited a conversation about whether that's the kind of epistemological approach that we want to promote. And also, I think that this is a real threat to kind of epistemic and epistemological diversity. So Mark Rubin talks about this a lot, really, really brilliant scholar in this space, and talks about how actually in trying to kind of mainstream some of these open science approaches, that this can also mean that it then becomes that open science is exclusive from people who are doing a particular type of research and framing bias in a particular type of way. So a few years ago, I got together with some colleagues and we were also interested in particularly what this can do for early career researchers. So I care hugely about early career researchers and the early career research experience. And so we asked in psychology, we asked some PhD researchers, have you heard about open science? What do you think about open science? What your experience is? And what was interesting is that a lot of people were telling us that that they find it daunting, that they can't participate because they think it's reserved for genius researchers doing perfect experimental studies. So there was this kind of idea that it was quite value laden, and that some people kind of thought that the kinds of research that they were doing sits outside of what it means to be rigorous, that they were seeing being perpetuated in some of these kind of dominant open science conversations. And this really interests me because I think that this is a problem. I think it's a problem if our open science isn't open to everyone. And I think it's a problem that we don't think specifically about what kind of epistemological underpinnings we are also kind of perpetuating with thinking about open science. So then I got thinking, okay, so I've done some work thinking about the early career researcher experience and about what this might be doing and kind of what these kind of open science tools and practices, what they might be promoting. So then I started to think about, okay, well, is there fundamentally maybe a different way of thinking about this issue that has been kind of problematized of researcher bias? And this is the stuff that I'm now kind of spending a lot of time writing about and thinking about and kind of trying to work through. This is also the question that I think feminist scholars have an awful lot to contribute to the conversation, as I'll talk about in just a sec. So just to kind of so we're talking about the same thing. So it's really interesting to me how a lot of the open science kind of conversations, at least in psychology, but also across different disciplines, how they kind of talk about open science or talk about the idea of meta science or science reform as something that is new, so as something that's kind of happened in the past few years. What's fascinating to me is that there is a lot of feminist scholarship that has already like grappled with this issue of researcher bias and what we can do about it for literally decades and decades and decades. So the other context to this is I've just finished writing a book about the history of women in psychology. And even from like one of the first replication studies that I could find of women researchers was like 1895. Like people have been doing this work and thinking in this way for quite a long time. So I think a lot of this is not necessarily me presenting new ideas, but more kind of honoring and celebrating some of the stuff that's kind of seems to have been missing from the conversation moving forward. So what's interesting to me is this idea of what do we do about this issue of researcher bias? Now, feminist scholars, and particularly feminist qualitative scholars, have given this a lot of thought over the years. So Sandra Harding, who very sadly died this month, actually, was a feminist philosopher and feminist researcher who kind of came up with this idea of feminist standpoint theory. And she talked a lot about how we are always within our research, that we're within it, and that it's therefore impossible for us to be kind of detached or objective or outside of our research. And this was the kind of crux of feminist standpoint, which is her kind of feminist epistemological theory. This kind of relates to this idea of positionality, which is essentially the position that we take as researchers. And my kind of argument is that we are always taking a position, even kind of whatever research that we're doing, the way that we design a study, the way that we decide what it is that we want to study, the fact that we think a study is worth doing because that research question is interesting to us, that this reflects a certain position that we have as researchers. So I put the pictures of glasses there because I like to think of positionality as it's the kind of lens through which we see the world. It might be a personal, it might be political, it might be psychological, it might be something else. But it's the kind of take that we have on our research and the way that we view it. And I really love this quote that knowledge is interested. That is, there is a particular reason why a particular question is of interest. And some people say this to me quite a lot, that they say, "Oh, I don't have positionality." That's not kind of relevant to me. And I think, well, the fact that this research question is worth asking means that reflects something about your positionality. Like it's not a kind of dichotomous, you have it or you don't. It's inherent. I think the kind of issue then is what we do with that notion of positionality. So is this something that we kind of lean into, or is it something that we kind of adhere to some of these open science tools and try to diminish or try to neglect? So here it is, reflexivity. So reflexivity is an act, it's a process, it's a thing that you do. And reflexivity is basically the intentional, deliberate, disciplined act of centering your positionality and really thinking through what that might be doing to the research. So Lisa Lazard and Jean McAvoy wrote this beautiful paper that I really wish I'd written. It's so gorgeous about what the point and practice of reflexivity is in psychological research. And they talk about how it's the act of considering, so how kind of including but not limited to how researchers' identity, so how our values, our background, our interests, our politics, our what's interesting to us, our personal stuff, about how that not only influences the research, but how it shapes it, how it colours it. And Sarah Ann Field, who also articulates this way more kind of eloquently than me, talks about how in all research methods that the researcher's background and position can affect all aspects of the research process. So even from what we choose to investigate to how that kind of investigation is communicated, that's an opportunity for reflexivity. And so Sue Wilkinson talks about how reflexivity, it's not, it's different to reflection. So reflection is kind of retrospectively what happened. Reflexivity is active and it's disciplined. So it's something that happens throughout the research process. And it's really thinking about what position do I have on what I'm studying, and how might this, as Lisa Lazarus talks about, how might this shape the research? How might this kind of inform and not necessarily bias, but how might this inform and color and shape what it is that I'm doing? And I think that this stuff is gorgeous, and it's fascinating to me how some of the kind of mainstream open science conversations, particularly in psychology and particularly in social psychology, that have been wrestling with issues of bias and kind of credibility, about how they very, very rarely kind of lean upon this literature and this thinking. So I've been trying to sort of connect the two a little bit more. So I'm always really conscious of not trying to kind of pit like qualitative and quantitative methods against each other, but I think that this is one where so reflexivity is a kind of hallmark of what it means to do really rigorous qualitative research. So it's been thought about as that your own positionality might not just be kind of inherently part of the research, but it actually might be it might be a useful analytical tool. It might be a useful way of strengthening research design, of asking the right questions, of interpreting it in the right way. So like reflexive thematic analysis talks about how qualitative analysis can benefit from centering reflexivity. There's also been work that talks about how this is actually an indicator of what it means to do rigorous qualitative research, that we don't kind of shy away from our positionality, instead intentionally embed that into the research process. It can be useful for when we're working with sensitive or emotional or difficult qualitative work, and it's part of training. And what's kind of interesting to me now is thinking about how can we kind of learn from some of these traditions, particularly in the context of some open science concerns in quantitative methods. So people have been writing about this for a really long time. There's just been like the literature has been slightly kind of disparate. So there's this gorgeous paper by Farron, which was written in 1990, which says that it's really important that we don't divorce data from context. And I think that there's a lot to be said for this in terms of like, I think positionality is context. Ackley and True talk about how what feminist research should do is it prompts us to inquire about how we inquire. In other words, engage in meta-science and meta-research. And I think that reflexivity offers a different way of thinking about how we might improve transparency in quantitative research, and also reframes the problem of bias differently. So it's more about kind of how can we acknowledge that bias will always be there, so let's center it and celebrate it, rather than trying to kind of endlessly try to diminish it and pretend it's not there. Particularly, and I think that this is why it makes most sense in social psychology, where we are like social humans researching other social humans, and we think that we can be detached, which is difficult for me to wrap my head around. So the paper that kind of triggered this kind invitation today, and the paper that's seems to be got a lot of people talking, it's kind of gone like slightly academically viral, like people want me to talk about this all the time, and we thought we were doing something quite simple, is some work that I did with my colleagues Michelle Jamieson and Gisela Govart, where we wrote about hey, reflexivity might be useful for quantitative research. And it also gave a kind of what we call like a beginner's guide to how this might be done. So what we do is we basically talk through all the different stages of research and give just some kind of prompts, some things to think about. So you'll notice that this starts all the way from the beginning of setting your research question and thinking through the design. So we think that there's some real benefit in even stopping to ask the question, why do we want to research this group? And out of all the people who could possibly research this group, why should it be us? And why me? Are we intruding? Could there be someone else who could do this work? Does that matter? Because I think people sometimes think that positionality and reflexivity is this kind of insider-outsider dichotomy, that are you in or are you out? And what we'd like to kind of encourage people to think a bit more about is what can we give to our participants who's represented, and to really like think this through. And this is also part of efforts to kind of slow down scholarship and research. So there's a really lovely idea of like slope in science that comes from open science, which I just think is really cute and lovely, that's trying to get people to just be a little bit more intentional and slow and thoughtful with their research. So it also comes into things like data collection. So do participants understand what their data will be used for? And I don't mean what's in the information sheet. I mean, do they really understand what this data will be used for and what it is that we're trying to do? Are we intruding? Are we being coercive beyond the stuff that we know we need to do to get kind of ethics or IRB approval? Like, is there a way of thinking and acting ethically that's beyond that? Can we kind of think about, is this really fair? Is this right? How can we kind of think beyond traditional systems of ethics? And then I think the place where people have had the most kind of energy in thinking about reflexivity is about like data analysis interpretation. So who are the actual people behind these data? So Michelle Jameson, who's the first author of this paper, does a lot of work with really, really, really big data sets in Scotland. So like large government data sets. And is saying that actually there's a value in reminding people sometimes that these data represent humans, and we actually need to think about the kind of privilege and trust that's involved in that in a kind of reflexive way. So could my analysis of this data set reproduce existing inequalities? So how could the conclusions that I draw from this data be weaponized? How could they be used in ways that might be aligned with our values, but also not aligned with our values? And then we kind of also talk about, like, even to the point where we're kind of writing up the study and thinking about the conclusions and thinking about framing. I think there's also questions that we give, and these are just like introductory things to think about. Like, how do we use evidence? So when it comes to kind of bringing in other studies and citations, like what does our use of evidence say about our biases? Are we kind of reflecting the whole literature? Are we being selective? Is that a problem? What do we gain? What does the population that we've studied actually gain from this work? So this kind of paper, which is it's been picked up and been used quite a lot, which I think suggests that it may have been speaking to something where there was a bit of an absence, is just trying to get people to think about, there's lots of different ways of answering these questions, and some of them might be, actually there's an opportunity here for bias, so let's try and do something about it, or it could be, let's lean into that a little bit more explicitly. So one of the ways that people can be quite explicit about this is through the process of writing a positionality statement. So this is an increasingly kind of popular practice, or it's increasingly kind of, it's a lot in like journal policies now in some areas of psychology. We're currently writing a paper about how to write positionality statements, because we see that there's a lot of people do them in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect reflexivity. But to give you an example, so this was a paper that was literally published on Monday. So this is hot off the press. Or was it last week? Whatever, recently. And this was a paper that I did with one of my colleagues, where we were interested in this idea of psychological literacy, which is basically the idea that psychology students should be able to do more from their degree than just recognize theory. So it should be about contributing to kind of solving real world issues. And we were researching how educators in the UK think about psychological literacy and how they integrate it into their practice. Now, the reason that Richard, my co-author, and I were interested in this study is because we think that psychological literacy is brilliant, and we think that it should be in curricula, and we think that it's really important. And so the way that we ask the questions in this survey and the way that we interpret the results, because it was mixed methods, is kind of, we think it reflects something about our worldview. It reflects something about how we view this phenomena. So we wrote a positionality statement that basically says, like, kind of, for context, this is the approach that we as an authorship team are coming from. This is why we chose to study this beyond what makes kind of empirical, theoretical sense. And this is the lens through which we view the data. And we find that this is a kind of way of heightening transparency while also trying not to pretend that we are unbiased. So that's a recent example. I think that there's also something kind of bigger here, which is about, so a lot of people have been talking about how some of the open science kind of mainstream open science conversations try to kind of inappropriately transfer quantitative logics to qualitative research. So what's been happening recently is a lot of qualitative researchers are saying, well, I can't participate in these open science conversations because it's not relevant to my methodological or epistemological point of view. And this means that there's this kind of very specific gold standard that's being perpetuated that is becoming increasingly limited. And what I really like about the kind of idea of reflexivity is I think that this is one of the few examples where there's real value in learning and borrowing from qualitative traditions and qualitative logics to actually think about how might that strengthen what we do as quantitative researchers as well. So I think it's kind of, without trying to kind of forge too deep sort of methodological different parties, I think that there's a way of responding to this, which is also thinking about how can we learn from what rigor looks like in different methods and different epistemologies and borrow from that and stop this kind of inappropriate transference that only goes one way. I think a very important caveat that I talk about a lot is about all of the stuff that I'm saying is not new. I have not invented the concept of reflexivity or invented the kind of idea that our positionality may influence things. And it's really important to me to kind of recognize what Sarah Ahmed talks about, that citation is memory, and the way that we cite and the way that we kind of recognize and honor other scholars' work, that becomes the legacy, that becomes the memory. And one of the kind of concerns that I have recently with some of the kind of mainstream open science conversations is that it has completely overlooked and completely marginalized some of the really important contributions that particularly feminist scholars, feminist philosophers, feminist psychologists have made in thinking about the problem of researcher bias. So I kind of see my part in this is about reconnecting. All of these people have been saying this stuff, let's borrow from it. And I think that also means that we are not kind of perpetuating this idea of epistemic injustice. So just to give you a bit of an idea, and then I just have I always like to include quotes because I always think that people are just far more kind of eloquent and intelligent than I could be. I like to include some quotes of people who have kind of been grappling with this in different ways. So this is a quote from, this is 1988. This is Mary Gergen, who's a social psychologist, and talks about how there's this kind of idea that science needs to be distant, uninvolved, neutral, and that if there's any form of personal relationship, it will contaminate the findings. And I love that she was really bold in 1988. She said it's not possible for humans to have objective contact with the research process. And it seems that there's a lot of kind of the open science reform, how can we do things better, that is kind of neglecting this idea. And it's not just psychologists. So there was one more. So Ruth Hubbard was one of the first ever professors of biology. She's a biologist, and she has this really gorgeous paper, and she talks about how how academic kind of style dictates is that we don't say, oh, there was one Monday I came in, I set up my lab, I did this, I had a coffee, I did my study. Instead, we're kind of, the way that we think about science is that we kind of record our work as like, it was observed that. And this deletes the science agent and our participation in the research. And I love this idea of so people are left with the concept of science as a thing in of itself rather than a thing that we do. And I love the idea of kind of like science as verb rather than science as things that happens that we are just bear witness to. So I think it's also, yeah, important to really recognize that this is kind of why it's not really a research talk, it's a kind of here's stuff to think about talk. That there's a lot of scholars, particularly feminist scholars, who have been making these arguments throughout history. And I think it's concerning to me that open science doesn't kind of recognize that, or at least kind of learn from that and take it forward. So my second caveat, and I have this graph on every single talk I've ever done, literally, and I found a way of making it relevant, and it seems to always be relevant because I think it's really important whenever I talk about open science, that I think that there is a direct relationship between upping transparency and what that means for how vulnerable researchers are. And I take vulnerability in every single sense of the word. So those people in the study who were saying, you know, I get a sense that open science isn't for me. That I think it's important that we also think about when we're trying to up transparency, particularly through the use of things like positionality statements, thinking reflexively, to also make sure that we really carefully think about if our culture is compassionate, constructive, and collaborative enough to be able to respond properly to that, and to be able to make sure that we don't kind of create a culture where everything's open, everything's transparent, and that we don't then have a culture that kind of can respond well to that, particularly with early career researchers. So to just give you like a bit of an idea, so this was one of the quotes from the previous study that I mentioned, where someone said, it really stuck with me. Open science is a great thing, but there needs to be more done to ensure that it's practiced with kindness and inclusivity. So people talked quite a lot about the kind of hostility, kind of meanness, what do I mean, hostility, that some people under the kind of guise of open science were engaging in. And I think that this is also an important caveat, that when I talk about how we can kind of make things open in terms of being reflexive and acknowledging positionality, that we also think about that we need to kind of take kindness and inclusivity really seriously, because that's research culture, and that also means that we're kind of reconnecting feminist values back with what we're trying to do. So some closing thoughts. Oh, I've timed this quite well. I don't know how, I just looked at the clock. Some closing thoughts. I think we do better work towards transparency and rigor if we really think about whether removing bias is always the thing that makes the most sense, and is always the thing that is the most kind of possible. So sometimes removing bias makes sense, sometimes centering it and celebrating it makes sense. And that, to me, is epistemology. That's what that's all about. So I'd really like to see more kind of proper conversations about how our kind of epistemological and ontological kind of underpinnings may impact some of the decisions that we make. Also, just to note that I'm also very aware that this is not uncontroversial. So there was a paper a few years ago that talks about the problem of positionality, that's questioning the value of reflexivity statements. This was published in February of 2023. I'm still writing a response to it, but I can't quite find the words. And it's what's interesting about this is that I think that the authors of this paper think that or kind of positionality as this kind of like reeling off parts of your social identity in a way that's quite performative. And I think that my argument is that it's not, positionality comes at the end of a process. It's not a thing that's a catch-all for, oh, look, I'm doing rigorous work because I've mentioned who I am as a person. It's something that marks a kind of intentional process that happens throughout the research. So also just to note that. But that's everything I wanted to say to you, and I'm very, very happy and excited to discuss it with you more. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much.